My half-sister sent me 70 intimate photos of herself with my husband at 2:21 in the morning. She included a message, 5 words. I'm gonna be the next Mrs. Calloway. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Not because I was naive, but because the cruelty of it was so deliberate, so calculated, so designed to humiliate that it almost felt like a work of art. She expected tears. She expected chaos. She expected me to call my husband screaming, to fall apart in real time, to become the unstable woman she'd already decided I was in her head. What she got instead was silence. And then, something she never saw coming. Here's the truth nobody tells you about betrayal. The shocking part isn't always the act itself. It's the moment you realize how long it had been happening, right there inside the life you thought you knew. The infidelity, the lies, the careful performance of a marriage that had quietly become a stage set, and the two people playing the leading roles behind your back were your husband and the woman who shared your blood. I'd been cheated on in every possible sense of that word. And I'd been shamed, designed to feel small, expected to crumble. But here's what they got completely wrong about me. I didn't crumble. I cataloged. Those 70 photos? I downloaded them, organized them by timestamp, backed them up in 3 locations, and cross-referenced the metadata until they stopped being evidence of my pain and became evidence of his misconduct. What started as a personal betrayal, a family drama so raw and so exposed that I genuinely couldn't believe any of it was real, became something the compliance board of a local university, the business press, and a family court judge would all eventually have very strong opinions about. The vengeance I found wasn't the kind you see in movies. It was the kind that arrives dressed in documentation and due process. And it was, I promise you, so much better. This is the story of how a single act of cruelty at 2:21 a.m. became the most clarifying, most transformative, most deeply justice-restoring experience of my life. Of how I took the worst thing that ever happened to me and turned it into the foundation of everything I am now. Of how karma showed up, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, methodically, one exhibit at a time. Of how I reclaimed my business, my daughter, my self-worth, and my peace. And of how, in the end, the woman they tried to make small became the woman who wrote the story. Stay with me, because what happened next will change the way you think about betrayal, dignity, and the very specific, very satisfying architecture of a life reclaimed. It was 2:21 in the morning when my phone lit up the ceiling of our bedroom, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My half-sister Dana had just sent me a message that read, "I'm gonna be the next Mrs. Calloway," followed by 70, yes, 70, inappropriate photos of her and my husband, Marcus. 70. Like she'd been counting. Like she wanted me to feel every single one. I sat there in the dark, heart hammering, the kind of silence that feels louder than any scream you've ever heard in your life. And you know what's strange? I didn't cry. Not one tear. I won't lie to you. The betrayal hit me like ice water straight to the chest, a cold shock so brutal it almost felt physical. Here I was, a 43-year-old woman who had spent 15 years building a life, a home, a family in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the two people I had trusted most had just decided to burn it all down and send me the receipts. The family drama unfolding on that screen was so shocking, so deliberately cruel, that for a second, I genuinely thought I was dreaming. But I wasn't. The timestamps were real. The faces were real. The humiliation was absolutely real. And I felt it all the way down to my bones. What Dana expected, I know this now, was for me to collapse. She wanted tears, a phone call at 2 a.m., screaming chaos. She wanted me unraveled, shamed, running to Marcus with mascara down my face so she could watch me fall apart in real time. That's what she'd banked on. Dana always wanted the Calloway name. It was less about Marcus and more about winning a ranking she'd invented inside her own head. She didn't want my husband. She wanted my place. The thing about being backstabbed by the people closest to you is that they always underestimate you. They see the version of you they've always controlled, not the woman who's been quietly surviving everything they've thrown her way. But here's what nobody tells you about the moment your life shatters at 2 a.m. There's this strange, almost eerie clarity that follows the initial shock. Like your brain shifts into a gear you didn't even know existed. I set the phone down on the nightstand. I took a breath so slow and so deliberate it almost felt like a meditation. I was calm on the outside. On the inside, my body trembled like it was running a fever. And I looked around that bedroom, the pillows Marcus had chosen, the curtains I'd hung, the framed photo of our daughter Lily on the dresser. And something inside me didn't break. Something inside me locked in. I wasn't going to let this be the story where I was just the woman who got cheated on. I was going to write a very different ending. Because here's the truth nobody says out loud. When someone hands you 70 photos thinking it's a weapon to destroy you, they've actually just handed you evidence. Dana thought she was sending me a message. What she actually did was load the gun herself and place it directly in my hands. I could feel the anger, yes. The vengeance starting to simmer somewhere deep, the desire for payback rising like heat under my skin. But I held it, controlled it, because the most dangerous thing a woman can do to someone who expects her to break is to not break. He had an event that night. That's what he'd said before walking out the door. Only now I knew that event was just another word. The bedroom was still dark, Marcus still wasn't home, and Lily was asleep just down the hall, completely unaware that our whole world had just been flipped upside down. I picked up my phone again, not to call, not to scream into the void, but for something else entirely. Something that Dana, in all her arrogance, never saw coming. I downloaded every single photo, all 70, and I did it with the same calm energy I'd used to sort laundry on a Sunday afternoon. Methodical, quiet, completely intentional. I know that might sound cold to some of you, and honestly, it probably was. But pain has this incredible ability to transform if you let it, and I wasn't about to let mine turn into noise when it could turn into evidence. I created a folder on my laptop, named it something completely neutral, and I started organizing everything by timestamp, by location data embedded in the metadata, by every single detail I could extract from those images. This wasn't grief. This was documentation. What I found as I went through each photo, slowly, deliberately, not letting myself feel it too hard, was that the betrayal ran deeper than I'd first understood. These weren't rushed, careless pictures taken out of desperation. They were taken over time. Different locations, different lighting, different outfits, which meant this had been going on for months, maybe longer. The infidelity wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a lifestyle. Marcus had been lying to my face through birthday dinners, through school events, through every I love you and every goodnight kiss. And Dana had been right there in the wings, waiting for her cue. The truth of it sat in my stomach like lead. I backed everything up. 3 separate places because I'm not foolish enough to leave something this important in one location. Cloud storage, external drive, encrypted folder on my desktop. I labeled each file like a paralegal building a case, because somewhere in the back of my mind, even at 3 a.m., I understood that emotions were temporary, but documentation was permanent. And here's where it got interesting. As I zoomed into the background of one particular photo, I noticed something that made me pause. A banner, partially visible, the kind used at galas and sponsored events. A step-and-repeat backdrop with a logo I recognized immediately. It was the logo of our business, the company Marcus and I had built together from the ground up. That detail, that tiny, almost accidental detail, changed everything about how I understood what I was looking at. Our company produced events. Ashford University was one of the accounts Marcus loved to show off. He was the public face, the one who shook hands at galas and got quoted in newsletters. I was the structure behind it. And in that photo, The backdrop wasn't just a detail, it was a trail. When you pay for an affair using company money, adultery stops being personal, it becomes accounting. I zoomed in closer, saved a high-resolution version, and stared at it for a long moment. The karma I'd always believed in suddenly felt very, very close. Through all of this, Lily slept down the hall, peaceful, unaware, still tucked into the childhood I had fought so hard to give her. And every choice I made in those dark, silent hours, every careful backup, every catalogued exhibit, every controlled breath, I made for her. She was the reason I couldn't afford to fall apart. She was the reason the vengeance I felt couldn't be reckless. It had to be smart. It had to be surgical. And as I closed my laptop just before dawn, I knew that the next call I made in the morning would set everything in motion. I had the evidence. Now I needed the strategy. And I already knew exactly who to call. I called Renata Voss at 7:14 in the morning, and she picked up on the second ring, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of friend she is. Renata isn't just my best friend. She's one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state of North Carolina, and she's the kind of woman who, when you tell her what happened, doesn't gasp or say, "Oh my God." She says, "Okay, tell me exactly what you have." And that's precisely what she said. I told her about the photos, the timestamps, the event backdrop in the background, all of it. And I could hear her already thinking on the other end of the line, already 3 steps ahead. That's Renata. She doesn't deal in shock. She deals in strategy. The first thing she told me, and I need you to hear this because it's the part that might seem counterintuitive, was, do not confront him. Do not say a word. Do not change your behavior in any way that would tip Marcus off that something had shifted. I'll be honest, that instruction felt almost physically painful. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pick up that phone, to call him, to demand answers, to let him feel even a fraction of the humiliation I was sitting with. But Renata was firm. The moment he knows you know, she said, he starts moving money, hiding assets, and building a story. You don't confront, you prepare. And just like that, the justice I was after had a blueprint. She laid out the plan with the kind of precision that made me feel for the first time since 2:21 a.m. like I was standing on solid ground. First, protect the business assets. Marcus and I were co-owners of a mid-size event production company, real revenue, real contracts, real accounts, and Renata needed to see every financial document I had access to before anything else moved. Second, establish grounds for full custody of Lily, anchored not just in the betrayal, but in his documented pattern of absence, financial recklessness, and the instability his conduct had introduced into our home. Third, build a clean, airtight paper trail before any lawyer he hired could muddy the waters. This wasn't going to be a messy divorce. This was going to be a dismantling. What struck me most in that conversation was how Renata kept coming back to the financial thread. "Follow the money, sweetheart," she said in that quiet, certain voice of hers. And she meant it literally. She'd seen cases like this before, she told me, where personal betrayal and financial misconduct ran side by side, and where the evidence of one almost always pointed toward the other. She wanted bank statements, contracts, invoices, anything that showed how money flowed in and out of the business over the last 3 years. I told her I had access to most of it. She said, "Good, then we're already ahead." I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite relief, but something close to it. Self-worth, maybe. The quiet, fierce kind that doesn't announce itself. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I thought about the word dignity. I'd spent 15 years accommodating Marcus, his moods, his priorities, his narrative of who I was in this marriage. I'd accepted so many small diminishments over the years, told myself it was normal, that every marriage had its compromises. But sitting there with the plan laid out in front of me, with evidence secured and an attorney I trusted completely, I realized that what Renata was giving me wasn't just a legal strategy. She was giving me back myself, and I wasn't going to waste it. Marcus came home that evening like it was any other Tuesday, like he hadn't been a ghost in his own marriage, like the 70 photos didn't exist. And I watched him walk through the door, and I smiled, calm, measured, completely controlled. And I thought, you have absolutely no idea what's already in motion. Marcus walked in just before 7 that evening, carrying takeout bags and wearing the expression of a man who believed, with complete confidence, that his world was exactly where he'd left it. And I let him believe that. I set the table with 2 plates, poured 2 glasses of water, asked how his day was. And every word out of my mouth was perfectly measured, perfectly even, like I was performing a role I'd been rehearsing for hours. Because I had been. The family drama playing out in my own kitchen would have seemed completely unremarkable to any outside observer, and that was entirely the point. The most dangerous thing I could do in that moment was act normal, and I did it flawlessly. But then his mother called, Beverly Calloway. And if you've ever had a mother-in-law who treats her son's wife like an inconvenient footnote in the story of her family, then you already understand the particular kind of exhaustion that woman had put me through over 15 years. Beverly had always operated under the quiet conviction that Marcus had settled when he married me, and she'd never quite forgiven me for not being more grateful about it. So when she called that night, voice dripping with manufactured concern, asking me if I was doing okay, I felt the trap being laid in real time. And that's when I understood. Dana hadn't sent those photos only to me. She'd planted the story somewhere else first. She'd made sure Beverly already knew before I'd had time to breathe. I didn't give her a single thing. I told her I was wonderful. I told her dinner smelled amazing and Lily had a great day at school. I kept my voice warm, unhurried, completely unbothered. And I heard the slight confusion in her silence, the tiny recalibration happening on her end because I wasn't playing the script she'd written for me. Beverly had always counted on my emotional availability as a weakness. She'd spent years framing my reactions as too sensitive, my concerns as overblown, my voice in this marriage as something that needed to be managed. But the woman she thought she was calling, she didn't exist anymore. I'd reclaimed something the night before, quietly and completely, and Beverly could feel the shift even if she couldn't name it. After dinner, I began, subtly, without drama, cutting the soft privileges that Marcus had grown so comfortable with. The dry cleaning I'd always picked up, no longer on my list. The calendar reminders I'd managed for his business meetings, quietly removed. The small, invisible labors that keep a household running, the ones that only become visible when they stop, I started letting them disappear one by one. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't confrontation. It was the slow, deliberate withdrawal of everything I had been quietly providing while he'd been lying through his teeth. Some people call it payback. I called it accounting. And I watched him notice. Not in a dramatic way. Marcus wasn't the type for dramatic realizations, but in the small, slightly confused way that people notice when the floor has shifted slightly beneath them and they can't quite explain why. He looked for his dry cleaning. He missed a meeting reminder. He asked if everything was okay at the dinner table, and I looked up from my plate and said, completely evenly, "Everything's fine, Marcus. Why do you ask?" And the slight flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, that tiny, involuntary crack, was, I'll admit, deeply satisfying. Not because I wanted to watch him suffer, but because I was reclaiming the room, inch by inch, on my terms. What neither Marcus nor Beverly understood was that this house, every wall, every window, every piece of furniture that I had chosen, arranged, and made into a home, was no longer the place they thought they could control. I had already been in conversation with Renata. I had already secured the evidence. And there was one more thing I needed to do before this story moved to its next chapter. Something that would make sure Marcus felt, for the first time, what it was like to lose the narrative entirely. Here's something nobody teaches you about being betrayed by family. The worst part isn't always the betrayal itself. It's the silence that surrounds it. The cousins who had no idea. The aunts who don't want to get involved. The quiet, collective agreement among everyone who knew or suspected something to simply say nothing, to keep the peace, to protect the man and let the woman wonder what was wrong with her. That silence is its own kind of backstabbing, and I had been living inside it for longer than I even realized. So when the time came to break it, I didn't do it with fury. I did it with precision. I called Renata first. She made a pause and then said, "If you're going to expose this, expose it with control. 4 photos, with timestamps, nothing beyond that." That was her authorization, not a confrontation, a calibrated release. I selected 4 photos, just 4 out of 70, and I sent them to the Calloway family group chat with a single line. "I think everyone deserves to know the truth." No exclamation marks, no accusations, no emotional commentary. Just the evidence, clean and plain, with a timestamp that made it undeniable. And then I put my phone face down on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and waited. The response was, and I say this with a calm I earned, absolutely explosive. The chat lit up within minutes. Aunts, cousins, Marcus's brother Derek, who I'd always liked but who'd never said a word. All of it suddenly, rapidly, unavoidably public within the family structure that had protected Marcus his entire life. I could hear his phone going off from across the house, notification after notification, the sound of a carefully constructed fiction beginning to collapse in real time. And for the first time since 2:21 a.m., I felt something I can only describe as the very first breath of justice. Not the full exhale, just the beginning of it. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. And I want you to picture this because it matters, with his phone gripped in his hand, and an expression on his face I had genuinely never seen before. Not anger, not denial, panic. Pure, unfiltered, losing control panic. Because what he understood in that moment was that the narrative he'd been quietly managing, the story where I was the difficult wife and he was the patient husband, had just been detonated. Not by me screaming. Not by me calling him names. By 4 photos and 1 sentence. The most powerful thing I had done was take the story out of his hands, and he knew it. He opened his mouth to speak, and I looked at him with the most serene expression I have ever worn in my life, and I said, "You should probably call your attorney, Marcus." Then I walked away. The shaming that followed, among family, among people who'd smiled at me for 15 years while apparently knowing something was off, was not something I orchestrated. It arose organically from the truth being seen. And I watched it happen with a strange, quiet feeling that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite sadness. It was something closer to clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop protecting someone else's lie at the expense of your own dignity. Dana had sent those photos expecting me to crumble. Instead, I had turned them into the match that lit up an entire room. But the family fallout was only the surface layer. Because even as Marcus was fielding calls and messages and scrambling to manage something he could no longer manage, Renata had been quietly pulling on a financial thread. And what it was attached to was far larger, far more serious, and far more incriminating than anyone in that family group chat could have imagined. Renata called me the morning after the family group chat detonation, and her voice had that particular quality it gets when she's found something. Lower, steadier, the verbal equivalent of a poker face. "I've been going through the financials you sent over," she said, "and I think you need to sit down." I was already sitting, but I gripped the edge of the kitchen table anyway, because something in her tone told me what she'd found was going to rewrite the story I thought I already understood. I'd known about the betrayal. I hadn't known yet about the theft. And yes, that's exactly what it was. What Renata had uncovered was a pattern that, once she explained it, seemed almost obvious in hindsight, the kind of thing that hides in plain sight because it's dressed up in business language. Marcus had been inflating vendor invoices on the company accounts. creating the appearance of legitimate business expenses, and then quietly redirecting the difference. Some of it was categorized as consulting fees for services that, when traced, led nowhere credible. Some of it appeared in travel expenses that didn't align with any event the company had actually produced. And a portion, the part that made my jaw tighten, was connected directly to funds I had contributed to the business from my own inheritance. Money my grandmother had left me. Money I had invested in this company because I believed in us. He had been cheating on me in every possible definition of the word. The financial infidelity was, in some ways, more destabilizing than the photographs. Because the photographs told me he didn't respect our marriage. The money trail told me he didn't respect me, my work, my sacrifice, my contribution to everything we had supposedly built together. I had poured 15 years and a significant portion of my personal financial history into that company, and he had been quietly siphoning pieces of it to fund God knows what. And I had a very good idea by now exactly what and who he'd been funding. The karma in that was almost poetic. He thought he'd hidden it in business language. He hadn't counted on Renata. What struck me most in that conversation was how composed I remained. A year earlier, even 6 months earlier, this revelation would have gutted me. But something had hardened in me since 2:21 a.m., and it wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. The vengeance I wanted wasn't emotional destruction. It was accountability. I wanted the truth to be documented, verified, submitted, and seen by every relevant party. I wanted the payback to arrive not as a scene, but as a ruling. And Renata was building exactly that. A case so clean, so well-sourced, so thoroughly supported by paper evidence that there would be no room for Marcus or his attorney to spin a counter-narrative. "There's something else," Renata said before we got off the phone. And there it was again, that lower, steadier tone. She told me that in tracing some of the financial discrepancies, she'd come across a reference to a scholarship foundation that Marcus had been publicly associated with, one tied to a local university. The company's consulting fees and the foundation's disbursement records crossed the same trail. He'd done press around it, LinkedIn posts, a local news segment, the whole performance of a civic-minded businessman. But the numbers Renata was looking at didn't quite add up to the story he'd been telling publicly. And one of the photos, one I had backed up and cataloged, contained a gala backdrop that connected directly to that institution. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my kitchen for a long moment, thinking about the word humiliated, how Dana had sent those photos to make me feel it, how Beverly had spent years engineering it, how Marcus had been conducting it slowly, privately, like a long-form project. And I thought, not anymore, because every thread they'd tried to use to unravel me had somehow become a thread I was now pulling, and I wasn't stopping until the whole thing came apart. The detail Renata had flagged was something I almost hadn't noticed the first time I went through the photos, a backdrop partially visible behind them in one image, the kind used at sponsored galas and institutional events. But once she pointed it out, I couldn't unsee it. The Ashford University shield, printed on a step-and-repeat banner, at what appeared to be a foundation gala I could match to a public event listing on the university's website. Marcus had posed as a major benefactor to the Ashford Scholarship Foundation, an annual fund that was supposed to support first-generation college students in our county. He'd been photographed at galas, quoted in the university newsletter, celebrated as a community leader. And now his face was in the background of a photo no spouse should ever have to see, taken at an event funded in part by money I recognized. I couldn't believe what I was connecting. Renata and I drove to Ashford the following afternoon, not as accusers, but as people with questions. She had framed a preliminary inquiry to the university's compliance office through a legal contact she trusted there, carefully, professionally, without tipping our full hand. What we learned in that meeting was delivered quietly and with the strained composure of someone managing something they hadn't expected. There were irregularities in the foundation's disbursement records. Grants that had been approved and listed in public documents didn't correspond to students enrolled in the programs they were supposedly supporting. And the authorization signatures on several of those grants bore a name I recognized. The shocking weight of what this implied settled over me slowly, the way cold water rises, not all at once, but inch by inch until you're submerged. Marcus had not just cheated on me, not just stolen from the business, not just been carrying on with my half-sister. He had potentially been using a charitable educational fund, one built on the stories of young people who genuinely needed support, as another layer in whatever financial architecture he'd been constructing. The word justice took on a different dimension for me in that hallway. This was no longer just about my marriage. This was about people who'd been lied to, used as cover, their dignity reduced to line items in someone else's scheme. I sat in Renata's car in the parking lot afterwards, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not just anger on my own behalf, but anger on behalf of every student whose name had been attached to a grant that may have served a very different purpose. The betrayal had scaled. It was no longer a family drama confined to a group chat and a pair of people who'd broken a vow. It was an ethical breach with institutional consequences. And the compliance officer we'd spoken with, to his credit, had not dismissed us. He'd taken Renata's documentation. He'd said the words, "internal review." He'd looked at me directly when he said it, with the expression of someone who understands that what they're holding is no longer small. Renata squeezed my arm in the car and said, "This is the part where we're careful, not fast." And I understood exactly what she meant. We had something significant, something that, handled carelessly, could be dismissed or muddied or buried under the kind of institutional defensiveness that protects names over truth. But handled right, with precision, with clean evidence and credible sources and the right timing, it could be undeniable. We needed one more piece, one more element that would bring everything into sharp, unquestionable focus. We didn't have to wait long, because the very next morning a call came, and it sent us somewhere neither of us had been expecting to go. The call came from an aunt I barely knew on Dana's side of the family, a woman named Rosario, who'd always seemed vaguely guilty around me at holidays, like she was holding something she didn't want to be holding. She told me Dana was in the hospital. "She's been there a few days," Rosario said. "She told people it was the flu." There was a pause. "It's not the flu." I thanked her, kept my voice neutral, and called Renata before I was even fully out of the room. Because whatever Rosario wasn't saying out loud, I could hear it in the breath between her words, and I had a very specific, very cold feeling about what we were going to find. We arrived at Mercy General mid-morning, and the lobby, the way hospitals do, was a study in ordinary human business. People with coffee cups, people in scrubs moving purposefully, a man trying to figure out the parking validation machine. Nothing about it looked like the setting for a revelation. But Renata, who has a particular genius for navigating institutional spaces with just enough authority to get what she needs, quietly asked a question at the right desk. And the answer came in the form of a floor number. Not the general medical wing, the 4th floor, the maternity ward. I stood there for a second and let that land. Then I followed Renata to the elevator. We didn't go into Dana's room. That wasn't why we were there, and Renata was clear about that. We weren't confronting, we weren't accusing, we were documenting. She didn't ask for medical records or details, nothing that crossed a line. She confirmed the ward and the visitor status. That was observable, that was enough. The shaming I had imagined Dana might one day feel, distant, theoretical, was suddenly very immediate and very real. And I want to be honest with you. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something more complicated than that. Because whatever Dana had done to me, whatever choice she had made, there was a situation unfolding on that ward that was larger than either of our pain. What complicated this further, the part that Renata's legal mind immediately locked onto, was the institutional dimension. If the pregnancy was connected to Marcus, and if Marcus's financial activities were under review by Ashford University, and if any of those activities had taken place at events funded through that institution. Then this hospital visit wasn't just personal news. It was potentially relevant to the ongoing compliance inquiry. Renata said it very quietly in the elevator on the way back down. This changes the liability calculation. I knew what she meant. Marcus wasn't just a cheating husband anymore. He was a man with exposures stacking on top of each other, each one making the others harder to contain. I walked out into the hospital parking lot and stood in the pale morning sun for a moment, breathing. 15 years of marriage. A business I had helped build. A half-sister I had, against all evidence to the contrary, trusted. And a man who had apparently decided that the rules simply did not apply to him. In his home, in his company, in the charitable work he used to make himself look good. The vengeance I'd held so carefully in check since that first night was not a fire I needed to release. It was a current, steady, directional, building toward something specific. And we were very, very close to the moment where it would arrive. Because something else was already in motion. Something we hadn't started. But that was spreading anyway, the way true things tend to spread when they find air. I found out about the leak the way most people find out when something about their life has gone public. A friend texted me a screenshot. It was a Reddit post. No names, but enough identifying details that anyone who knew the parties involved would recognize the story immediately. Someone in the family group chat, or someone who'd heard from someone in the family group chat, had taken what I'd shared and put it into the world in a way I hadn't authorized. And the thread had responses. Hundreds of them. People reacting with that specific electric indignation the internet reserves for stories of betrayal that feel both personal and universal. The thread title read, "She found 70 photos. Guess what she did next?" I stared at my phone for a long time before I called Renata. Renata's response was, characteristically, the opposite of panic. "This was going to happen," she said. "The question is whether you let it run without you, or whether you step in front of it." The leak hadn't created the storm. It had only opened the window, and we already had the dossier ready. She explained the choice with the kind of calm that made it feel like we were discussing a business decision, which, in a sense, we were. Option 1. Say nothing, wait for it to die, and risk the narrative being shaped entirely by speculation, partial information, and whatever story Marcus's side decided to tell if they got ahead of it. Option 2. Guide it. Not with a tabloid tell-all, not with an emotional outburst posted at midnight, but with a carefully structured disclosure, delivered to the right parties in the right order, built on the clean, verified evidence we already had assembled. The choice was obvious. It was also terrifying. We spent 2 days preparing the disclosure package, Renata and I at her kitchen table with takeout containers and highlighters, and every document I'd backed up since 2:21 a.m. The financial irregularities from the business accounts, the time-stamped metadata from the photos, the compliance concerns at Ashford University, the corporate filing discrepancies, all of it organized, cross-referenced, with nothing sensational and everything sourced. Renata submitted it simultaneously to the Ashford Compliance Board, to a business journalist she trusted at a regional outlet, and to Marcus's corporate attorney, so that no one party could claim ignorance and no one party could bury it quietly. This was not gossip. This was a structured submission. There is a significant difference. And then, the way it does when the thing being released has real weight behind it, it moved. Within 72 hours, the journalist had published a careful, well-sourced piece that named the foundation and the financial discrepancies without naming me or Dana directly. The Compliance Board issued a statement confirming an active internal review. Marcus's attorney, I was told secondhand, called Renata within hours of the article going live. Not aggressive, not threatening, but with the particular tone of someone who is beginning to understand the dimensions of the problem they're managing. The story had crossed from the private sphere into the public record, and the momentum was no longer something anyone could simply switch off. I sat with Lily that evening. She'd been at my mother's for a few days by then, mercifully unaware of most of the specifics. And I read her a chapter from a book she liked, and I felt the strange double existence of that moment. The public storm and the private peace existing simultaneously, both real. The payback wasn't what I'd imagined in those first dark hours. It wasn't dramatic or loud or satisfying in any cinematic sense. It was this: truth, documented and delivered, landing exactly where it needed to land. And Marcus, I knew, was finally starting to feel the ground give way beneath him. The part that no one had anticipated, not Marcus, not Beverly, not Dana, was what came next. Because the public response to that article wasn't just institutional, it was personal. And it was coming from a direction nobody had prepared for. The morning the story fully broke, when the regional piece got picked up by a larger outlet and the thread on Reddit had climbed past 10,000 responses. I was in a coffee shop on the east side of Charlotte, the kind with mismatched chairs and a handwritten specials board, and I watched Marcus's LinkedIn profile views, which someone in our mutual network helpfully tracked and reported, spiked to something surreal. His carefully curated image, the civic leader, the foundation champion, the thoughtful businessman, began to crack in real time, in public, in front of everyone who'd applauded it. The toxic fame that had been building around his name was not the righteous, dramatic kind you see in movies. It was slower, more bureaucratic, and in many ways more devastating. The quiet removal of his name from the Ashford Foundation website, the unanswered calls from professional contacts, the LinkedIn connections quietly unfollowing. The humiliation came dressed in silence. Dana disappeared from her social media entirely. Her accounts, which had been, I'll note, fairly active up until the night she sent me those photos, went dark in stages. First, her Instagram stories stopped. Then her posts stopped. Then the accounts themselves went private, and then, within a week, seemed to vanish entirely. I don't know what she was managing in those days, and I want to be truthful with you. Whatever she was going through, part of me felt a grief for it that surprised me. Not absolution. Just the complicated human reality of having grown up alongside someone and watching them make choices that brought everything down. The betrayal was real. So was the loss. Those two things can coexist. Beverly, on the other hand, did not go quiet. Beverly rallied. She made calls, sent messages, worked the extended family network with the dedication of someone who has spent decades managing the Callaway reputation, and was not about to let it unravel without a fight. The narrative she pushed was a familiar one. I had been unstable. I had always had issues. The whole story was being exaggerated by a woman scorned, and those of you who'd fallen for it needed to step back and hear the real version. What she hadn't factored in, and what I watched play out with a quiet, steady satisfaction, was that the real version was no longer hers to tell. Because the compliance board findings were public, the business filing discrepancies were on record, the journalism had done its job. Beverly was trying to build a dam out of words in the face of a documented flood. Dignity, it turns out, can be weaponized, and mine had become a fortress. What I noticed in myself during those days was not the satisfaction of revenge in the way I'd imagined it. It was something quieter and stranger. The absence of the anxiety I had been carrying for years without fully recognizing it. The hypervigilance of managing Marcus's moods, interpreting Beverly's comments, navigating Dana's closeness while never quite trusting it. All of that weight I hadn't even named as weight was simply gone. I moved differently. I slept differently. Lily noticed before I did. She told me one afternoon, matter-of-factly, that I seemed like myself again. A child said that. Sometimes children see the most clearly. Marcus, through it all, became a smaller figure. Not the looming managing presence he'd been in our home, but something reduced, a man fielding institutional inquiries and professional consequences and family estrangement all at once. I heard from Derek that he had moved out of the house he'd been staying at, and was now in an extended stay hotel somewhere near the airport. The image of that, the man who had cheated, lied, stolen, deceived, and expected to emerge unscathed, now alone in a hotel room near departures, was not something I celebrated. But I won't pretend it didn't register as karma arriving, quiet and complete, right on schedule. The public chapter of this story was nearly closed, but the most important chapter, the one that would determine the actual shape of our lives going forward, was just beginning. And I walked into that courthouse with Renata at my side, and a clarity in my chest I hadn't felt in 15 years. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, between the compliance inquiry and the court dates and the professional fallout and the Beverly-managed counter-narrative, I published something. It wasn't planned. It was a Tuesday afternoon and Lily was at school, and I was sitting in the quiet of my house, and I opened a blank document and I started writing. Not for anyone in particular, not as a strategy, just the truth, in my own voice, in the order it had happened, exactly as it felt. I wrote about the 2:21 a.m. text, about downloading the photos methodically, about sitting in Renata's car outside Ashford University, about the hospital, about cutting the dry cleaning off the list, about the coffee that went cold while I tried to remember who I was before all of this. I wrote for about 2 hours, and then, almost accidentally, I published it. On a personal blog nobody had read in 3 years. And I closed the laptop and made dinner. By morning, it had 40,000 views. Within 72 hours, it had crossed 6 figures. By the end of that week, it had been shared across platforms I didn't even actively use, and my inbox, which I was not emotionally prepared to open, contained thousands of messages. Not from journalists, from women. Women who said, "This happened to me." Women who said, "I thought I was the only one." Women who said, "I found the messages at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. or a Saturday afternoon when I came home early." Women who said, "I didn't know you were allowed to be strategic. I thought you were just supposed to fall apart." The response was, and I say this without exaggeration, the most shocking thing to happen to me in this entire story, and that is saying something. What I hadn't understood until that moment was how thoroughly I had been shamed into silence before I ever made a sound. The culture around betrayal, particularly for women, particularly in the context of family, carries an invisible expectation. Grieve privately. Maintain dignity by disappearing. Don't make it a spectacle. What I had done by publishing that piece was refuse the silence. And the volume of response told me that the silence had been functioning as a collective cage, one that a lot of women had been inside without anyone naming it clearly. The truth I'd shared wasn't just my truth. It was a mirror that tens of thousands of people recognized themselves in, and that transformed something in me that the legal victory alone could not have. The self-worth I'd been quietly rebuilding since that first night, one careful, deliberate act at a time, suddenly had company. It had echo. It had the weight of collective recognition behind it, and that changed its texture entirely. I wasn't reclaiming something just for myself anymore. I was part of a conversation that a lot of people had been trying to start for a long time, and somehow my particular story, with its specific details and its specific refusal to be only a wound, had become an entry point. Women reached out from Georgia, from Ohio, from the UK, from Brazil. One woman, a grandmother in her 70s, who had never posted publicly about anything in her life, sent me a message that simply said, "I waited 40 years to see someone say this out loud." I read that message 4 times. I started responding. Not to everyone. There were too many. But to as many as I could manage, in batches, in the evenings after Lily was in bed. And what grew out of those responses was something organic and unplanned. A small community, a comment section that had become, somehow, a site of genuine solidarity. Women sharing legal resources. Women asking about attorneys. Women saying, "I did this too," and "Here's what helped me." The vengeance I had originally imagined, The private, clean satisfaction of a legal win was still coming, but it had been joined by something I hadn't expected. The recognition that healing is not a solo project, that justice is louder and more durable when it's shared. And the last battle, the actual legal one, was the one that would close the formal chapter. The morning of the final hearing, I wore a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Not dramatic, not performative, just the color of someone who knows exactly where they stand. Renata met me in the courthouse parking lot with coffee and the specific calm of a woman who has been building toward this moment for months and is completely confident in her materials. We didn't say much on the walk in. We didn't need to. The work was done. The case had been built document by document, timestamp by timestamp, exhibit by exhibit. And what waited inside that courtroom was the formal recognition of what had already been true for quite some time. That Marcus had violated our marriage, our business, our finances, and his public responsibilities, and that the law had a category for all of it. Marcus arrived alone. I noticed that first. No Beverly stationed strategically in the gallery. No Derek offering quiet moral support. Just a man in an expensive suit who had somehow managed to look both overdressed and diminished at the same time. His attorney was competent, thorough, and clearly working with a significantly weaker hand than he would have liked. There had been negotiation rounds before this final hearing, and Marcus's side had tried several approaches, questioning the admissibility of certain documents, attempting to characterize the financial irregularities as accounting oversights, suggesting that custody arrangements be structured around both parents' professional obligations. Renata had addressed each attempt with the same methodical, unimpressed efficiency. By the time we reached the final hearing, the terms on the table were almost entirely ours. The ruling came with the particular quiet authority that courtrooms have when everything has been thoroughly and properly adjudicated. Majority control of the company transferred to me with a structured buyout of Marcus's remaining interest, confirmed by a forensic accounting report that documented the pattern of diversion. At that point, the company stopped being a dispute and became a reparation. Full custody of Lily, grounded not in adultery alone, but in the documented pattern of absence, financial instability, and the risk his conduct had introduced into her daily life, reviewed annually with supervised visitation structured around her needs. A separate proceeding to address the financial misconduct charges, which the court formally noted as ongoing and separate from the divorce itself. It was thorough. It was documented. And it was, without a single raised voice or dramatic confrontation, an absolute dismantling of every advantage Marcus had believed he held in this marriage. I didn't cry in the courtroom. I had cried, once, alone, at about 4 a.m. on a Thursday 3 weeks into all of this, sitting on my bathroom floor. And that had been sufficient. What I felt when the judge concluded the proceedings was not euphoria. It was something more grounded and more durable than that. The quiet, bone-deep satisfaction of justice arrived at through legitimate means, through patience, through the refusal to be reckless when every instinct had been screaming to react. The payback was real. The vengeance was real. But it wore the face of documentation and due process, and that made it permanent in a way that no scene ever could have been. I looked at Marcus across the courtroom as Renata gathered her files, just once, briefly, with no particular expression I could name. He looked tired. He looked like a man whose story had run out of road. And I thought about Lily, asleep at my mother's house, completely unaware of the formal proceedings of this day. Perfectly intact, her world protected. That protection had been the organizing principle of every decision I'd made since 2:21 a.m. Not vengeance, not anger, her. And I had delivered. We walked out into the afternoon light, Renata and I, and she said something I've thought about every day since. You didn't let them make you small. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the sky, at Charlotte moving on around us in its ordinary afternoon rhythm, at the space that had opened up in my life that I hadn't yet begun to imagine how to fill. And I thought, That's exactly right. They tried, and I didn't let them. And now, the rest of the story is mine to write. I rearranged the living room the week after the hearing. It sounds small. It wasn't. Every piece of furniture in that house had been arranged around Marcus's preferences, Marcus's sightlines, the particular geography of a man who took up space without asking whether anyone else's space was being consumed. Moving the sofa 6 feet toward the window, hanging a painting I had always loved in the spot he'd always vetoed. These were not interior design decisions. They were declarations. The house started to feel like mine. And then, slowly, quietly, in the way that real shifts tend to happen, so did everything else. Professionally, the company had never been in stronger hands because for the first time it was in my hands alone. I brought in 2 new clients within the first month, renegotiated vendor contracts that Marcus had left deliberately unfavorable. I understood now why. And hired an operations manager who, within 8 weeks, told me with some wonder in her voice that the company's margins had improved significantly. I had always been the one keeping the engine running while Marcus handled the visibility. Now I handled both. The reclaiming wasn't loud or ceremonial. It was Monday through Friday, coffee going cold on my desk because I was too focused to remember to drink it. It was real work, and it felt extraordinary. Lily and I developed a new rhythm together, mornings with more time in them, weekends that belonged to us without the low-grade tension that had been present in our home for years without my ever consciously naming it. She asked me once, carefully, in the way children ask things they've been composing for a while, "Is Dad okay?" And I told her the truth in the only version of it appropriate for a 10-year-old, that her dad was going through some things, that she would still see him, that none of it was her fault, and none of it would ever, ever touch her sense of being loved. She nodded, satisfied, in the way kids are satisfied when they sense the adult is actually present rather than performing presence. We baked a chocolate cake that afternoon for no reason at all. It was, genuinely, one of the best afternoons of my life. The blog community had grown into something I hadn't anticipated managing, a space that required real attention and real responsibility, because real people were bringing real pain to it. I set boundaries around it carefully. I wasn't a therapist. I wasn't a legal resource. I was a woman who had been through something and had written about it with honesty. But I showed up for it consistently, and what it gave back to me was a sense of purpose that I hadn't expected to find on the other side of this chapter. The shame that Dana had tried to install in me, the humiliation she had designed to be permanent, had been transformed, somewhere along the way, into something that helped other people feel less alone. That transformation is, I think, the most complete form of justice I can imagine. What I understand now, and I want to say this plainly, for anyone who is sitting in their own 2:21 a.m. right now, is that dignity is not passive. It is not something you preserve by staying quiet and absorbing whatever someone decides to do to you. Dignity is what you reclaim, actively, deliberately, one documented truth at a time. The best revenge is not making someone else suffer. It is living well, loudly, in full possession of your own story, in a home that feels like yours, with a child who trusts you, with a community of women who recognize themselves in your voice. It is standing in your rearranged living room on a Tuesday afternoon with the sun coming through a window that faces the direction you chose, and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, completely, entirely, at peace. Lily asked me recently what I wanted to do next, and I smiled and I said, everything, because I'm finally free to. So, here we are. The dry cleaning I stopped picking up, the 70 photos that became exhibits, the compliance board, the courtroom, the navy dress, the rearranged living room, the chocolate cake baked on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason at all, with a 10-year-old who told me I seemed like myself again. That is what justice looks like when you do it right. Not a scene. Not a breakdown, a life, rebuilt from evidence up, on your own terms, in full possession of your own story. And now I want to hear from you. Because I know that some of you watching this are sitting with something. A message you found, a name in a phone, a family member who smiled at you while knowing something you didn't, a moment of betrayal you absorbed in silence because you didn't know you were allowed to do anything else. So I'm asking you directly, what would you have done with those 70 photos? Would you have confronted? Would you have gone quiet? Would you have documented and strategized? Or would the pain have been too loud to think through? And for those of you who have been through something like this, or worse, I want to know, where are you now? What did your 2:21 a.m. look like? What did you reclaim? What are you still reclaiming? Drop it in the comments. Not because I want the drama, but because the women who read this comment section deserve to know they're not alone. Your story, even a single line of it, is the thing that might help someone else pick up their phone and call their Renata. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar, or clarifying, or like a breath you didn't know you were holding, hit subscribe and turn on the notifications. Because what comes next on this channel is more of exactly this: the complicated, documented, deeply human architecture of betrayal, dignity, justice, and the very specific art of reclaiming your own life. No surface-level takes, no easy answers. Just the truth, told as completely and as honestly as it deserves to be. You've earned that. Come back for it.